Hi, I'm Greg Cootsona, co-director of Science for the Church, and I'm so excited about the conversation today with Brent Rome, who is lead pastor of One Family Church in St. Louis. Brent is also a member of our board of directors at Science for the Church. So, Brent, I'm really excited to talk with you today.
It's great to be with you, Greg. I'm thrilled to talk with you as well.
And your support and friendship and modeling of how to bring together faith and science in the congregation is like a continual inspiration for me and my colleague and co-director, Drew Rick Miller. So again, I'll begin with a word of thanks. Thank you for that. Um, I was wondering, if you wouldn't mind, I think one of the most fascinating things about many of the fascinating things about you is your backstory. Can you tell us just a little bit, or tell me a little bit about like what are some of the things you've done besides being a pastor?
Okay. Yeah, I'll give you the fast and furious version. Um, but let me just say also before I do that, I am always inspired by you and Drew and what you're doing. And I just honestly, like when we jump on a call, I walk away from those calls exhilarated, inspired, excited about the direction of the church, and thankful for the work you're doing because I think it's hugely valuable and hugely important. And I think Science for the Church is an extremely valuable organization that will grow and impact over the years. So I'm honored to be a part of it. So thank
Thank
you.
you. Well, thank you.
Um, so yeah, backstory. My dad. I grew up in a ministry home. My dad was a pastor. His dad was a pastor. My mom's dad was a pastor. All my uncles were pastors. So I grew up around, and we grew up kind of old school Pentecostal environment, and so there were a lot of amazingly beautiful things about the way that I grew up. One of the challenges I think in the way I grew up was that there wasn't a focus on science. There wasn't a focus on education. It was a very blue collar working class environment, which is amazing and beautiful. But there just wasn't that emphasis on the pursuit of knowledge and the life of the mind and science. And I think even to some extent, a lot of the church that a lot of folks like me grew up in were a little intimidated and by science. And
Right.
anyway, so I grew up in that environment, and for many years, I actually walked away from the church completely.
Hmm.
I was curious about. I had an opportunity to go to college, and which was an opportunity that my sisters and I were the first of our family to go to university, and so.
Wow.
Um, but I think the challenges posed by university education um, versus the way we grew up. There was just a almost a polarizing experience there.
Right.
Cognitive dissonance, I think they call it.
Right. Right.
And and so I walked away from the church for many years and did a lot of other things. I got an opportunity to go study at Oxford, and I went and studied in
And
England.
you were a Rhodes Scholar. I got to put that out there, man. That's so impressive.
That's right.
That's not easy to get that.
It was an amazing experience. Went and studied at Oxford. Then I got involved in theater. Went to India and toured India with a British theater company, and we did
Hmm.
King Lear, and we did a Noel Coward play all through India.
Oh,
Then I
wow.
moved to LA, and I worked in TV and film for many years and music, and really was just sort of like exploring and wandering, the world.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I actually came to faith after my father passed away in 2004,
Okay. Yeah.
and he was a great pastor. You know what I
Hmm.
mean, and a wonderful
Yeah.
guy. And I think when he died, I really began to re-examine what I was going for in life.
Yeah.
But again, one of the challenges for me was the intellectual challenge of how
Right.
does the Christian faith withstand, you know, science and
Right.
reason and logic and
Yeah.
and I began to read a lot of the works of like Francis Collins,
Right.
and I began to read like N.T. Wright, and I began to read C.S. Lewis. I began to read some of these Christian thinkers who also embraced deeply the life of the mind, and it had a major impact on me, and it was helpful for me as I journeyed towards Jesus, as I journeyed towards faith.
Right.
Became a Christian in 2005, and then really when I became a Christian, I knew like ultimately I was going to have to be a pastor. Like I was like, well, because I knew even as a young man that was the calling that God had put on my life, and I just that decade or more of wandering was a way. It was a Jonah, go to Nineveh or go to Tarshish. Which direction going to go?
Right.
And I was going to Tarshish, and so. But when I became a Christian, I said, okay, I gotta turn around and go the direction that God had called me to go. And at that time, I was in law school. So I finished law school. I called my uncle. I actually almost dropped out of law school to go to divinity school. But my uncle, who has been in ministry for all of his life, said, look, go to finish law school. And if the Lord really wants you to go into vocational ministry, he'll make a path for you. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
So I finished law school, moved back to my hometown of St. Louis, and worked at a law firm there for several years. But every year I'm like, I gotta do it. Finally, my wife was like, look, you got to stop talking about it. So we started going to church planting, conferences, and I began to talk to a number of other pastors. And then in 2011, at the end of 2011, we launched the church that I now pastor.
Right. So you've been at that church for your entire career as a pastor.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. So the problems of the church and all the goodness of the church, it's all about you. I mean, you can't blame anybody else for the problems, at least, right?
That's right. That's right. Like if anything's wrong, that's on me.
That's right. Exactly.
I got nobody to point to.
I mean, I say that it's a reference to what I heard Erwin McManus once said. It's like after 7 years as a pastor, if you're complaining about your congregation, you're the one to blame, man. You've created those people. So when you've actually founded the church, you really are.
That's it.
Yeah.
You got no excuses. Yeah. Fortunately, I absolutely adore our church community. I love our church family, and well, you'll get to meet them in a few weeks, but amazing group of people.
Well, it really seems like it. I mean, just the way, well, let me just go back a step. As a pastor myself, one of the other roles that I've been in and even doing now, you can tell from other pastors if they love their congregation. And that's like, and if they don't love their congregation, one of the things as a pastor is leave, right? Because you can't pastor people you don't love. And you just ooze appreciation for your congregation. I've seen you interact with some of the members, and it's just really powerful that way. So I'm excited. Drew and I are excited to be out with you and to be there in person and see what One Family Church is like.
One of the things that was really cool was when we launched, I was still an attorney. So I was full-time pastor, and then full-time attorney, and then I was pastoring like nights and weekends.
Wow.
And what happened during that time was extraordinary, because the church congregation basically said, look, we want to help build a community here. We want to help build a church here. And so people just took on responsibility.
Wow.
And the church really kind of, the culture of the church became a very servant leadership model type of church.
Right.
And you'll see that. But like, people just stepped in. They're like, look, the pastor's working 50 hours a week at another job. Like, let's dive in. And so it became that very deeply collaborative, collective kind of environment. And we call ourselves One Family Church, One Family. And that's what it feels like. It genuinely, even though it's gotten much, much bigger than it was at the beginning, it still has very much it has a very much of a family feel,
Yeah.
So, praise
God.
God.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit about, the family of One Family Church, and maybe a little bit about the context of One Family and how you are saturated with scientists in your midst. But just say a little bit more about that. Whatever comes to mind when I say context of One Family Church, bringing together faith and science. What's that like for you?
What's so interesting is, so our church is located so we're in St. Louis, right? And in St. Louis, there's two divides. There's a county city divide, right, there's where there's the city of St. Louis and there's the county of St. Louis. And so there are a lot of things that have to do with race and ethnicity and class and all of that stuff, right? That falls along that dividing line. There's also a divide called the Delmar divide, which is basically a north and south divide in the city.
Hmm.
Our church literally sits right square at the center of the city county divide and the Delmar divide. Right, we're actually on Delmar Boulevard at the city county line.
Yeah.
So it is a complete cross section of every imaginable kind of people.
Yeah.
Washington University is 3 blocks from us, from our just south of us. So there's every sort of race, tribe, tongue, ethnicity there, but there's also every kind of socioeconomic class, social class, level of education, PhD and GED sitting together in the pew, being in small groups together, ministering together.
Yeah.
And so that has really had a huge impact on our church. We do, because we're right next to Washington University, we have a ton of people from WashU, like students, grad students, professors that are all part of the mix. And it's been wild the way that has happened. We've had, I've baptized people from the philosophy program. There are people from the hard sciences. There are people from the humanities there. I mean, it's just been an incredible experience, and they're all kind of rubbing shoulders and interacting with people from the community that may, like I said, may not even have a high school degree.
Right.
And it's amazing.
Everybody in the family, I mean, there's a diversity within the family, right? Which is really amazing. And it sounds, I mean, like, yes, you have the education, you have the scientists, and you also have a breadth of racial ethnic diversity. Isn't that right, Brent?
Yeah, we're probably, I mean, these are rough numbers, but we're probably 45% African American, 45% white, and then we're probably 10% sort of international people from mostly international students, people
right,
from Africa, people from Asia, people from Latin America. So that's an incredible mix of people, especially for St. Louis, where there's so much racial tension, there's so much ethnic tension in our city.
Right.
To be a part of a community like that. I mean, honestly, people walk in and they're just like,
how does this happen, right?
How does this happen in this city,
And how does it happen, Brent? I mean, that's such a important issue for our country right now. Is how do we, especially as a church, how can the church be a sign of different tribes and tongues and races coming together?
I really think so for the church to be that, there cannot be us and them.
Mm-hmm.
There cannot ever be an us reaching out to them.
Yeah.
Whichever group you think is us, it makes everybody else feel like a them.
Okay.
And so I think at a very deep heart level, I always refer to us as all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have GEDs and we have PhDs. We are Black and we are white. We're Hispanic and we're Asian. So there's no culture of the church or identity of the church that isn't all of that.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I mean, there are deep theological reasons and deep theological teaching in that way, right?
Right.
We are neither Greek nor Jew, right? There's neither male nor female, for we are all one in Christ. All that stuff, right?
Right.
But I think Paul means that actually, like, completely.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, has to be fundamental, right? We can't be a Black church reaching out to white folks. And we cannot be a white church reaching out to Black folks. And we can't be a poor church trying to reach out to rich people, or a rich church reaching down to poor people, right? It cannot be us and them. The church has to literally be us. And so from every level of leadership throughout the congregation. You're going to find all people of all those, not only just those ethnicities, but also of those backgrounds and those socioeconomic levels.
Right.
We
Right.
don't see somebody as a PhD as superior to somebody with a GED. You know,
Right.
probably the most influential person in our congregation before she passed last year was a woman that we call Mother Ray, who, grew up, literally like in the cotton fields,
Mm,
and like, just was a spiritual powerhouse in our
mm.
church family.
Wow.
We called her the mother of the church, and she was there from like week 4. She came
Oh
the
man.
very first Christmas, and she never left. And her kids are now in leadership, and her grandkids are now in leadership, and now her great grandkids are growing up in our church. And so
Yeah.
that's I think how you do that is you start to understand yourself fundamentally and primarily first as a member of the body of Christ,
Right.
and then all of your other identities, while important, follow that fundamental identity.
Right. Well, this is one of the things that you know well as far as science for the church. We really, one of the things that one of our main teaching emphases is about race and working toward anti-race or against racism, but also to bring about connection among different racial ethnic groups. And I think science is really powerful in that way, which I could go into, but that's not, I'm talking to you. I'm asking you the questions. I'll just say that I remember you did a really great series on race and science, and
Yeah.
I felt like you brought it home really well. Do you want to say anything about that? Because I thought that was
Yeah.
really
Yeah, we
profound.
did a series called Reimagining Race through the Eyes of God. This was after George Floyd was murdered, and there was just so much pain and so much, um, there's just pain and
Yeah.
angst, and so we just kind of, one of the things that we do as a church is like we just kind of lean into the heavy stuff and hard stuff. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
what we found is that it's actually so much more healing to do that,
Yeah.
even if we get it wrong, than it
Right.
is to be like tiptoeing around it and avoiding stuff.
Yeah.
And then I just did a series we just wrapped last week, 2 weeks ago, on race, sex, and politics in the church. Um, so that was fun. But yeah, no, I think science does have a lot to offer us, right?
Yeah.
We have a theological perspective that we are one family, but science tells us that actually biologically we are one family.
Right.
We are very, very closely related to one another.
Right.
Very
And
closely.
even our biological differences as Homo sapiens is so minimal compared to
Right.
other species, right? Which
Right.
I just find, I mean, there's so much to say, but that one fact is so fascinating. And then I remember you did a really good, really great job of highlighting how race was brought in by white Europeans, especially late 18th century, early 19th century, as a way of demonstrating or whatever, bolstering a case for European superiority. So like a lot of what we see as race was actually brought in not as a scientific thing,
Right.
but as a colonial thing,
There was a pseudoscientific glaze over everything.
right. Yeah.
Immanuel Kant, and for all the good things that he did, also was the one who kind of crystallized this concept of red, yellow, black, and white as if
Yeah.
it were a biological category.
Yeah.
And what we know now through science is that there's as much, if not more, biological variation within a so-called race as there is between races.
Yeah.
And so not that ethnicity doesn't matter, and not that we're colorblind, because we're not. Like, we actually need to understand and respect and honor the uniqueness and differences that we have. We also need to recognize that race does not have a basis in biology.
Right. Right.
And so it's not a hard and fast category.
Right. I mean, cultural categories still have a lot of import, right? Like
Sure.
you're saying, but that kind of scientific basis for racism and scientific racism, I felt like you just did such a good job of undermining that narrative and then bringing in the narrative of God's creation of all of us, right? I mean, I think that's biologically, we have this really strong foundation for the unity of all people, but we also have that great theological foundation of God's creation of us, right? So it's like, I just feel like, I don't know, I love that sermon series. And, I think that's one of the ways I see you bringing in the insights of science without saying, hey, I'm doing science all of a sudden. It's
Right.
like, I'm just bringing in resources that are really important.
Right.
Do you mind saying a little bit about that as a preacher? Like,
Yeah.
how do you bring in science into your preaching?
I love bringing science into the preaching. What I like to do is make sure I talk to the scientists beforehand, and make
Yeah, right.
so
Yeah,
that so that the thing that I'm saying is actually factually accurate.
right.
But I think kind of the way you guys see it, I think science is a form of worship. I think
Hmm.
science, studying the work of a painter, is a way of honoring the painter.
Right,
Studying the work of an artist is a way of honoring the artist. And so when we study the work of creation, we are studying we're studying God.
yeah,
We're learning about God. And so
yeah,
everything that God makes is a reflection of God. And so when we do science and when we study science and when I incorporate science into a sermon, I'm incorporating God's general revelation. I'm incorporating his handiwork. I'm incorporating the creative brilliance of the God we serve into my sermon.
right,
So it just it for me it kind of just easily folds in
right,
because it's
right.
just for me it's like a science a scientific study is just like another kind of another sermon illustration for me,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
I might use a narrative, I might use some kind of a story about somebody, I might use a personal life experience, or I might use science because these are all metaphors for who God is, right? And
Right,
it actually help us to understand God better. Um, so
right.
that is one of the things. Now, like I said, I am cautious to make sure that I'm not stretching a scientific idea to fit within a theological idea that I'm trying to promote. You know what I
Right,
mean?
right, right.
So that's where you can really go awry. And of course, also people can Google you live during your sermon.
Right,
So,
exactly.
so you need to have your story right, and you need to have your stuff together.
And
Um,
like if your phone's on, they might even be texting you when you get back to the seat. You're like,
totally,
hey man, you missed that one.
totally, totally. Um, yeah, but what I see the scientists light up when I start to go down. I used Hallie Nyans is that optometry student in our PhD student in our congregation, and I did an interview with her for Science for the Church. But then I actually got an eye exam from her,
Oh
and
wow.
I used that eye exam as an illustration for um, the principle of removing the splinter out of your own eye before, or removing the plank out of your own eye before trying to get the beam or the splinter out of somebody else's eye.
Right.
And I used the study of optometry as a sermon illustration for that theological idea, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
talked to her beforehand and make sure I'm doing it right. But yeah, those kinds of things can just fold in easily at all times. And um, I don't think I think they actually strengthen your sermon,
Right.
right? I think they actually enhance your sermon,
Yeah.
and they also signal to people who are scientists and are serious about the life of the mind that you also are serious about that,
Right.
and that you don't are not going to denigrate science, or you don't find science to be in conflict, or you're not in some sort of combative stance with science, right?
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, so it just kind of folds into everything we do.
I love that. I mean, there's so much there. And I mean, you said so much really well. And I would just add that I think you have a humility about you and a creativity and a curiosity. Like those are all really important. They have to come together if we're going to engage whatever field, but science being one of those sets of fields. Like as preachers, we got to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be curious,
Yeah,
but I'm also going to be humble and
right,
say, there's something I don't know and I need to learn. And I'm also not going to go beyond what I've learned. Right.
right,
I
right.
think that's really critical to make this work.
Right. It's easier to do that when you have the scientists sitting in the first and second row, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just like if I go beyond what I know, I'm busted. Like I know what they know.
Right.
They know what I don't know.
Right.
So yeah. So that's I think that's and maybe it's sort of a cycle, right? If I don't overstate my knowledge, that gives them some assurance that they're in a kind of a safe environment as people who think deeply, and then by them being there, that helps me to to be cautious not to overstate my knowledge. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's kind of
Right.
a positive cycle that happens there, you know.
Well, and I think, we have this paradigm we've set up called the standard model, which pairs a scientist with a church professional, usually pastor, and it doesn't have to be one-to-one. It's almost like the standard model for you is like pastor leader connecting with all kinds of different scientists, which is a wonderful way to do this. But it has all that effect of you working this out in relationships, and that's such a key to the church. You're also, like you said, you're validating their work. You know what I mean? And to reverse the analogy, I'm sure when you were a lawyer working as an attorney, if somebody was going to use an example from the law in the pulpit, you'd want that to be accurate.
It needs to be right. It needs to
Yeah,
be right. Yeah.
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 So it's the same kind of thing. Whatever we've studied, if we're sitting in the pews, it's great to know that we've been validated, and that, hey, if the guy gets, or the person gets it wrong in the pulpit, he or she will ask us, right? I think that's really important too.
Right.
But it's that relationship, I guess, that what I go back to is like, you have obviously important relationships with the scientists that are in your congregation.
It's interesting because I think, you know how all of us are sort of, I think many of us are more aware of other people's gifts than we are of our own gifts. You know what I mean? Like the things that we do that come naturally to us don't feel like gifts. They just feel like that's just what I do or who I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always not enamored of scientists, but I'm definitely always like curious about what they're thinking and what they're doing. I admire what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
So I want to learn from them and I want to grow by listening to them. And they seem to be interested in what I'm doing as a pastor, and teaching theological ideas, right? And which to me just seems like, oh yeah, I mean, that's just my normal thing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because there's a mutual curiosity there. And I think when we are, as pastors, when we're genuinely interested and we're not intimidated, and we're not like combative with science, man, the you just reap the rewards of that in not only the relationships, but then in the sermons and in the quality of what you can present to your congregation.
Wow. I mean, every time you talk, almost I get inspired. You bring tears to my eyes. But I love that mutual curiosity. That just hit. I think that's just a wonderful phrasing for it. And in the churches that we've seen who have the most cultivation of the faith science connection and the scientist with the pastor, it is that mutual curiosity. And I would guess part of that is also, if I may say, a mutual respect, right? That you are bringing something as a church leader and you're saying to them, they're bringing something in their field as well. And that's really powerful.
Well, you also, I think for me, having kind of been, because science was one of the reasons that I left the church as a young person, right? Because the way that I was thinking about God could not fit with the way that I was thinking about science.
Okay.
Or, yeah, I think that's right. The way that I understood the text was in contrast with the way that I was understanding what was, what I was learning in science.
Yeah. Yeah.
So whenever I meet a scientist who's also a Christian, I know that they also have considered we've gone down so many of the same paths. We've gone down so many of the same trails. We've navigated so much of the same intellectual territory and spiritual territory that I almost think I just kind of feel an affinity towards them, because I know, by and large, some of the things that they've had to think through in order to land squarely in with both of their feet in science and with both of their feet in the faith.
Yeah.
Right. And so that I think also creates an affinity between me and the scientists that I serve, because I know, like, for many scientists, they're in an environment where if they're a scientist at a university in the United States, and they're also a follower of Jesus, they're in a minority by and large in their environment.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so they've had to navigate a number of deep questions, theologically, spiritually, and also, scientifically and intellectually, to be able to land where they've landed.
Right.
And so I
Well,
think, yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so there needs to, so I feel an affinity towards them, and I have a deep respect for where they've landed and how they've gotten.
Yeah. And I think one of those affinities that I've experienced as a pastor is because in some context, there is a resistance to the idea of being a scientist and a Christ follower, that a person who is a scientist and a Christ follower has had to hear their vocation. Of course, they're calling to Christ, but also they're calling to science maybe a little bit more intensively, right? And I think that's my point being, I get really a deep sense of calling or vocation from scientists in my congregations, and that's been really powerful for me and very inspiring.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They've gotten there the hard way, really. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
they've had to think through some very deep things, and they've had to wade into some deep waters to be able to land where they've landed.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And boy, we need them today, don't we? We've got
Yeah.
this world that's just emerging with so many different scientific and technological breakthroughs, and therefore challenges. I mean, the power that science and technology are giving us is really profound. So, part of what you're doing and what you model as part of what we love at Science for the Church is that way that we're seeking to nurture leaders who are Christ followers in these really significant professions of science and technology.
I think one of the things that makes it even more pressing is that one of the raps against the Christian faith is that it's anti-scientific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the, all the stats that you look at. That's one of the reasons young folks, are leery and wary of the church, because they think that it's anti-intellectual and anti-scientific. And when you have bona fide, strong, bright scholars and scientists in your congregation who are saying, I love the Lord Jesus,
Yep.
and I love the pursuit of knowledge at the university,
Yeah.
you're creating a new path for people,
Right.
so that it doesn't have to be this or that.
Right. Right.
I remember when I was becoming a Christian, I met a physicist who was a believer, and I just found it so refreshing. I hadn't crossed the line. I hadn't become a Christian yet, but I remember like talking to him and thinking like, wow, he's a Christian and he's a physicist. This is down in Arizona. He was at ASU at the time, and I was just listening to him, marveling that like he had found a way to be a respected, respected scientist, and a respected, or and a genuine, authentic Jesus follower.
Yeah.
And I hadn't run into that many people like that.
Right. Right.
And so I don't know. He kind of helped to clear a little bit of the path for me.
Right. To give you an example of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Brent, are there any particular ways that you've had initiatives with science and faith at One Family? I don't want to pigeonhole this question too much. I mean, it feels, as we're talking, to be a very organic relationship.
Yeah.
Are there any particular programs or initiatives or projects that you all have done at One Family?
Most of it has been very organic. So like, during COVID, a bunch of scientists sort of came together with me, medical scientists, right, to make sure that we're navigating things really well.
Yeah.
Of course, we did a STEAM grant. This is several years ago.
Science theology for emerging adult ministries. Yes, that was a grant that I just to make sure people know what that is, right?
Yeah. And that was another great opportunity to bring people from the congregation, other ministry leaders in St. Louis, and some scientists from our congregation together.
Yeah.
So there have been some of those kinds of initiatives over the years, but like you said, for us, most of it has just kind of emerged very organically, where scientists are kind of involved in. We've done it, I think a lot of them had to do with the STEAM grant, but most of the more formalized ones were through that.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's mainly just happened on its own.
On its own, and out of the relationships, and you're bringing it into the pulpit, which is really, I mean, I think that's probably, well, in my experience of church, that's usually the biggest event is the preaching of the word, and as you bring in science into that, it just integrates science and faith for people really effectively, I think,
It sure does.
Yeah.
I get and I'll get emails every once in a while, but just like it's almost like a sense of relief
Hmm.
from the
Hmm.
scientists in our church that go,
Yeah.
oh, wow, thanks. Like
Yeah.
I, you know, I heard one scientist say um, that it's actually in his case, it's easier to be a Christian in the sciences than it is to be a scientist in the church.
Yeah.
And so when, as a pastor, you embrace science,
Right.
right, and you don't mock it or belittle it or denigrate it in any way, the scientists in your congregation just go, like, okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
they know that you honor the work that they're doing. And
Yeah.
especially, like you said, if they have a strong sense of vocation and they're pursuing science through a deep theological conviction that God made the stuff they're studying, then man, you do not want to denigrate that. You want to
Right.
blow blow oxygen into that ember and let that flare up because that is powerful. It's beautiful.
Right. Yeah. Totally. Well, as always, I could talk with you all day, which is so fun. And the times that we have done that, it's been great.
Yeah.
So let me ask you one last question, though. Is there any particular message you would like people to hear? Science for the Church seeks to engage science to enhance the spiritual life of congregations, right? So is there any angle that you would want to tell the church about engaging science and what it means? Any message there
Yeah,
for the church?
I would say to pastors, don't be afraid of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe there are some pastors that are just not afraid at all. But I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of pastors that are sensitive around this because they know that people in their congregation, have different views about science and. But I would say you will be surprised by how thankful, grateful your congregation will be just by you opening conversations, right?
Right.
And so that would be my big statement to the pastors of churches that are watching this. Don't be afraid to do this.
Right.
Don't be afraid to engage science. Don't be afraid to embrace science for the church. It really, truly will enhance the spiritual life of your congregation. And the initial awkwardness or discomfort that you may experience will immediately be swallowed up by the gratitude and the spiritual growth of the congregation. And so go for it. Like lean into this. Make this a part of the life of your church and watch the fruit.
That's a great place to end. And Brent, as always, thank you. I should just talk with you whenever I'm feeling like I need some inspiration in life. So you're obviously a great pastor. And obviously the way you bring together faith and science is inspiring to me and to many others. So thank you so much for this for this conversation and for your congregation as well.
Yeah, man. And thank you. And you guys be encouraged because honestly, truly, I just believe that what you're doing is timely and extremely important and extremely valuable and relevant to where we are as a culture and where the church needs to go. So thank you, man.